Hi folks, my name's Tim Sweeney. I'm the CEO of Inflammatix, and I was asked by Freemind Group to talk a little bit about our company's non-dilutive funding journey, which includes both grants and contracts, because we've been decently successful over the years, and I hope that some of the learnings from our journey might help you in your own as you attempt to enter the world of non-dilutive funding. I have to say, we do have several contracts, and I'll talk about them in this work. And of course, any work discussed here is not representative of U.S. government policy or opinion. So to start, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what Inflammatix does. Inflammatix is a novel molecular diagnostics company, and in particular, we're focused on building a new kind of diagnostic, one that works by reinterpreting the immune response. And one that runs fast enough to fit into workflows in acute care or emergency rooms or ICUs to radically improve patient outcomes. Now, there's really no such thing as a perfect diagnostic, but we think that the immune system comes pretty close, which is to say when the immune system senses disease, it knows what it's reacting to. And really a lot of the challenges in modern medicine are understanding what the immune system is reacting to and then trying to solve that. And so underlying all of our technology is groundbreaking computational technique that allows us to decode immune signals to basically to use the gene expression patterns of the body's immune system to inform us what is this immune response about, what's underlying the sickness, etc. And relevant for you is that we've been able to turn this into a pipeline of tests that's pretty deep. And importantly, each single test has its own non-dilutive funding available or potentially available. So you can see here 6 tests. Each one has been successful in gathering funding from the likes of DARPA, BARDA, the NIH, even overseas funding bodies. And I think this is really important, right? You can't get paid by the government to do the same work by 2 different agencies. And so if you sort of want to build a big program, there has to be enough non-overlapping different programs, and in particular different programs that meet different agencies' funding needs to be of interest. Now, I'm not saying that you should go out necessarily and build a bunch of stuff simply because the money's there, but our pipeline has grown slowly, and certainly partially because we think we've been able to attract non-dilutive funding to begin the development efforts in each of these areas. Now, I won't go into the specific pipeline itself, but suffice to say that each of these tests uses some portion of the body's immune response read out as messenger RNAs, host immune messenger RNAs, to inform on different aspects of acute infections, sepsis, the severity of a response to a viral infection like COVID, and also then, as you see at the bottom there, a couple of looking into treatment response predictions. Now, all of these tests for us are going to be run on our system that we call Myrna. Myrna is for sort of mRNA. And Myrna is a rapid high-multiplex point-of-care system. You can see we're developing 2 separate kinds of cartridges, one that works on a venipuncture tube here in the middle of your screen, and one here at the top right, a finger stick version that has a few smaller wells available. But basically, this rapid test system will be 30-minute sample to answer, entirely self-contained, 0 prior sample prep, so really useful at the point of care. And as you can see in the pipeline, potentially sort of useful in many, many different clinical scenarios. So Inflammatix is really bringing together 2 innovations. One in the test system itself and our ability to measure all of these analytes very quickly in a self-contained system in less than 30 minutes. And the other is this computational pipeline that allows us to come up with this content, the selection of the genes, the hardened machine learning that ultimately turns that selection of mRNAs into useful clinical insights. Now, our first product to market will be what we call our INSEP test, which is focused on sepsis and acute infections. And I think it certainly helps. It is very important in non-dilutive funding to pick a big problem, right? Dollars tend to go where there are big problems. Sepsis is a big problem. And I'll take just a few minutes, if you don't mind, to just outline what our solution is in this space. I think it's interesting. It might be a little bit useful to see how we tell the story. Sepsis, this is all pre-COVID, was responsible for or associated with 50% of all hospital deaths. It was the spend of 40% of all ICU dollars. It's the single most expensive U.S. diagnostic code. And so you know that there ought to be a desire on the behalf of funding agencies to fix this problem, right? It's a huge problem in terms of both lives and dollars. And sure enough, there are in fact several funding agencies interested in solving the sepsis problem. Now, our particular focus on sepsis is that sepsis actually is really misunderstood, we argue, by sort of traditional diagnostic tests. Most people think of sepsis as being just a bloodstream infection, here in the sort of purple Venn diagram. But the reality is bloodstream infections make up less than half of cases of sepsis. Most cases of sepsis are a skin and soft tissue infection, a belly infection, a pneumonia, that never penetrate the bloodstream. And so looking just for bloodstream infections is really doing a disservice to all the patients who have an infection that's never penetrated the bloodstream. But further to the point, there's maybe 1 million cases a year of sepsis in the United States. There's probably 20 times that number of patients that show up in an emergency department who need to be diagnosed either with an acute infection or with sepsis, or sort of ruled out for both conditions. And so there's a very large opportunity here that's underserved. Imagine today that you go in with a cough and a fever, you're going to get something like, a complete blood cell count, a metabolic panel, maybe a procalcitonin, probably a lactate, a chest x-ray, sputum culture, blood culture, maybe a nasal swab, right? You're like 7 or 8 tests. And the problem with that is not necessarily just that there's a lot of testing involved. It's that if you actually look at the data, that testing is actually not very successful in getting physicians the information that they need to treat these patients. So this is a New England Journal article from 2015 that looked at this scenario. You have a patient with a cough and a fever showing up in the emergency department. And in this case, they had 2,300 patients like this, all of them who had a chest x-ray that subsequently confirmed that there was a pneumonia. So, symptoms of a pneumonia, chest x-ray showing a pneumonia. And the question was, when we do microbiological testing, how often are we able to find the pathogen underlying this pneumonia that we know is there? And the results are on screen. You can see here a nasal PCR panel, a blood culture, sputum culture, urine serologies. Every bit of microbiology that was sort of known at the time was unable to detect a pathogen in well over half of cases, 62%, despite knowing that pneumonia is present. So it's not enough just to say, hey, we can detect bacteria. What we really need is something that can understand what might be ailing a patient, even if they're very sick. And our products basically, what they do is they look, instead of looking for the pathogen, they look at the white blood cells. So you can see here this sort of schematic. Imagine for a minute you have a patient with a pneumonia deep down in their lung, and you see here this air sac, bacteria swimming around, not penetrating the bloodstream, but you can see the white blood cells come out of the bloodstream, they fight the infection, and then they re-enter the bloodstream. And by reading out the pattern inside those white blood cells, it turns out we can detect the presence of an infection deep down in the lung. So not just bloodstream infections, but any local infections. We can also differentiate whether that infection is bacterial or viral. We can risk stratify for whether the patient might become septic. And we can do this really fast because the material is very abundant. So that's the sort of thing that we're building here at Inflammatix. And obviously it meets a pressing clinical need pre-COVID and of course in COVID times as well. But we didn't always have this all worked out. And so maybe it's worth just sort of walking through a little bit of our funding journey. First, before I start, let's get one piece of nomenclature straight. Grants and contracts are different. We've had both. SBIR grants, sort of advanced public purpose, as it says there on screen. You work with a funding agency, maybe you talk to the PO, but really you submit your specific aims, right? It's defined by the PI. And basically once that, realistically, once the grant is given, there's not too much checking in on whether or not you're successful. It really just comes up again next time, right? You will still get the funds even if you are unsuccessful in the specific aims. Whereas contracts are built, to benefit a government in performing its public duties, right? So BARDA is interested in protecting the public and maintaining American health security. Okay, so they're gonna enter several contracts that will further that aim, which means they have their own funding objectives. They will walk very much with you in the scope of work, determining what are the right steps. And ultimately, if you're not successful, that contract can be canceled. It's a binding contract that you have to deliver certain parts of to get sort of the next tranche of funding. And there's lots and lots and lots of different ways to fund all these contracts. And certainly if you end up in negotiations for a contract, you should have someone help you who's familiar with that. Our journey started with an SBIR contract with DARPA. So we actually, in May 2016, we had just incorporated Inflammatix. We applied and had talked to the PM before applying. Great guy, Colonel Matt Hepburn. Talked to him about the potential goals we wanted to see, that we wanted to build as part of this contract, and he agreed. So we after sort of getting his advice, put in an application. You can see on screen there from May to September, it took us to selection. So selection, hey, we popped champagne. Oh my gosh, we're going to get $1 million, which seemed amazing at the time. But we didn't understand that was meant, we're now moving to contracting. And it actually took, as you can see, until February of 2017, months later, until our funds actually arrived. So Inflammatix got started off of this DARPA SBIR, but we were very surprised with how long it took to get through that contracting process and really sort of get the funds to flow so that we could actually kick things off in the lab. Now, since that time, you can see here sort of a rough schematic of the number of opportunities we've applied for. For a couple of years, it was just DARPA. That was all we had success with. And we made some applications, number of applications over the years, something close to 20. But it really wasn't until 2019 that we finally were successful with our big BARDA application, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And since that time, it's been an almost yearly recontracting process, which is important to understand with BARDA. We also got some other success with the BARDA Drive sub-agency, with DARPA, the NIH, et cetera, during COVID, and even outside of COVID. The only thing I'll take away is this. Funding rates are like somewhere between 5 and 30%, depending on the agency. So expect failure, right? I mean, we've had 6 or 7 successes, and we've had, as you can see here, about 20 applications. So we're kind of hitting that range. Funding cycles are super long. This is not cash that's available tomorrow or next month. This is, hey, we think we might want to do this thing in 6 or 9 or 12 or 18 months. Now's the time to start planning for it. But it's also really worth it. And the reality is Inflammatix has pulled down about $30 million today and has about $40 million of non-dilutive funding remaining in our contracts. That's not chump change. That's really something that has enabled our business to be successful in our goals, and also, of course, to attract further investment in terms of venture capital. Now, BARDA specifically, lots of people ask. So we have a BARDA contract that is worth up to $72 million over 7 options, and so that's of interest to folks. How do you get something like that? And I'll say here first about the timeline. I think that's really important. You have to understand. Our timeline was about 18 months from sort of real initiation of talking to somebody at BARDA about a program we wanted funding until the funding actually came. And you can see here, we called and discussed at a high level what programs we might be building. We talked about whether a tech watch would make sense. In July, a few months later, we finally had that tech watch to pitch the idea formally. We were invited to submit a white paper. The white paper led to a full proposal in December of 2018. That full proposal went in March. And by the way, the timelines you're given are often quite short, just a couple of months. We want to see this very shortly, so be aware of that. But you can see here, from March to June, only a few months to make a decision, selected for contracting, and that contracting phase took 3 or 4 months, and then the contract started. So you can see 18 months to funding. Be prepared for a long journey. The other thing that's important, in particular, I will say this with BARDA because we have the most experience with them, but this is true for DARPA or any other contract agency. It is a partnership. Both sides during this long sort of 18-month process are assessing the other. Is this something we want to do? On the business end, do we want to have all of these sort of extra processes that we need to go through in order to get this done? And of course, on the BARDA side, what they're trying to figure out is, is this a program that we wanted? In my opinion, it is definitely worth it, being on the far side of it, but it's something that is real and should be considered. few points on working with BARDA more broadly. Definitely, you have to learn about contract types. What is firm fixed price? What is cost plus? What's an OTA? What are the FARs? These things are going to matter to you a lot during contracting. I would also recommend considering cost sharing, as it does show the government that you have skin in the game. This is something that matters to you as a business. Be ready to negotiate a statement of work, and really focus on what deliverables you're going to deliver along the way. Right? It's a report. It's a plan, and then eventually it's a product. But the government needs to show something. They're very concerned. What do we say to Congress when Congress says, well, what'd you get in return for our money? So be prepared for that. At each phase we have to deliver something to the government. There will be a lot of contractor clauses that come through in the FARs, timesheets, program management, data management, government accounting, invoicing. This is not something you can do at the seat of your pants. You need experienced people. A lot of those are available as consultants, but don't take this lightly. You really there's even they will look at your books. There is audits. It really does matter. Another part about the contract is you will invoice after you spend, so you'll need working capital to be successful. This is not a grant where you get $10 million up front, go spend it for a year. This is every month we invoice for what we've spent, so we have to come up with that working capital beforehand. And finally, there's a lot more to this than money. I mean, I know everybody wants the money when they're building a startup, but the reality is subject matter experts at BARDA and intergovernment communications. BARDA being able to talk to FDA on your behalf, for instance, is extraordinarily useful. Look at it as a partnership. Look at you're trying to enter a partnership. What are the aspects of this partnership that you can bring to the table, and what are you hoping for BARDA to bring to the table in addition to just the money? And I think if you have that viewpoint, you'll be successful. And finally, I just, sort of across the whole program of non-dilutive funding, what are some lessons learned over the years? I think it matters a heck of a lot to get to know your program manager or program officer beforehand. Just chat with them, understand that what you're building is aligned with the funding agency's goals. Follow the rules, do the paperwork, cross every T, dot the I. We have worked with Fremont Group. Fremont Group can help with this. They're very good. But if NIH wants a different resume format than BARDA wants, you gotta follow the rules and do it. In particular for SBIRs, having sat on a couple of panels, commercialization plans is often where things fall short. Each funding agency really in SBIRs wants to see your work ultimately become a product. And so you have to have a clear understanding of how this SBIR will transition into the phase 3 of sort of what's next. Who's going to fund this next? How's it going to become a product? How are you going to grow revenues? That really matters. It's not just science. And the last is, we use this kind of rough rubric on the right internally. You have to apply when your interests align with the funder's interests. Obviously, if you're not interested, they're not interested, you're not going to apply. But there is definitely a case of, well, I applied, but it wasn't core to the funder's mission, so my application is rejected and I wasted a lot of time. And definitely it is also true, I applied for this thing to get some money, but it's not really core to my mission, and now I'm stuck managing this grant and my business isn't really being furthered despite the fact that I have extra money. You can be sorry you got the money. So really it's looking at the opportunity, talking to the PM, understanding your own goals. If your interest is aligned with the funders, that's when you're going to have success. Thank you very much for listening. If you're interested in learning more about Inflammatix, you can always reach out info@inflammatix.com or find us on Twitter or LinkedIn. We are hiring right now, especially in manufacturing. So if you're interested in joining the team, please take a look there as well, inflammatix.com/careers. To Fremont Group, thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'll look forward to taking any questions. Thanks so much.